So, in Parshas Devarim, begins in a very interesting way. Moshe Rabbeinu is giving reproof to the Jewish people. What Moshe Rabbeinu is about to do throughout the Parsha is do a review of what has happened over the last 40 years. So let's follow along, and we'll see there's a bit of a difficulty with the way Moshe Rabbeinu does this. Starting on page 938, 939, Moshe Rabbeinu first lists a number of mistakes that the Jewish people made. He does not say them explicitly, he just gives kinds of code words for each one. And then Moshe goes on to describe, so let's follow along. The Torah tells us it was the 40th year in the 11th month, the first day of that month. Moshe speaks to the Jewish people. When did this take place? We're now on page 40. After Sichon and Og were destroyed on the other side of the Jordan in the land of Moab, Moshe begins to explain the Torah to the Jewish people, saying the following. Hashem spoke to us in Chorev, saying, you guys have been here a while. It's time to travel to Har Emori, Bahar, Bashvela, Banegev, all the way to Eretz Yisrael. Behold, I have given you the land. Go, inherit it. This is the land that I have promised your forefathers, Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. Meaning, the simple understanding of the beginning of the Parsha is that Moshe was saying that right after Har Sinai, you were supposed to go directly into Eretz Yisrael. Now that you have the Torah, you're supposed to go into Eretz Yisrael. But instead, you guys messed up. How did you mess up? So you have to kind of turn a couple of pages to get all the way to Pasuk Chav Beis, Pasuk verse 22, where he says, and then you asked for spies. And the spies came back with a negative report. And then God punished your forefathers, your fathers, that they would not enter Eretz Yisrael, and instead they would die in the Midbar. That's the way the Parsha should have begun. Moshe Rabbeinu is relating to them why it's the new generation which is standing at the borders of Eretz Yisrael. In between, Moshe is saying, you were at Chorev, and I told you, and Hashem told us that it's time to go. Before Moshe says, and then you messed it up with the spies, Moshe inserts a whole Parsha. And that is, starting on Pasuk Tes, after Hashem told me to travel, this is on page 940, after Hashem told me to take the Jewish people and to travel, I said to you at that time, Lo uchal levadi se'es eschem. I can't take these people alone. How? I'm unable to bear the burden of these people. Hashem has increased you so many. In fact, Hashem should increase you more. But Echa Esa Levadi Tarchachem Umaasachem Verivchem. Interesting that Moshe invokes the word Echa. How can I bear the burden of the Jewish people? Moshe, it says that after Hashem told me to take the Jewish people into the land, I told him that it's too much. So instead, what we did was, we appointed judges. We appointed Chachamim, Nevonim, Viduim. I suggested this to you. As we're reading this, I want you to try to remember where in the Torah we had anything like this. And you answered me, and you said, great idea, Moshe, we should do this.
Didn't Israel suggest it to Moshe? Moshe said it was a good idea?
That's right. Well, we'll see.
Moshe asked Hashem.
This is exactly the problem, but we'll get to that. Okay. So I took the leaders of your tribes, and I appointed them the masters of thousands, the masters of hundreds and fifties and tens, and I told the judges, and then Moshe gives us, in his review, the rules that he gives the judges. Why is that relevant to anything? Why is this important? And then we traveled from Chorev, and that's when you guys approached me and you wanted spies. So it's very difficult why Moshe brings up this whole story of Judges, describes it differently than what we know from the beginning of the parsha, which we'll get to in just a minute, and uses that as somehow the bridge to understand what went wrong with the Jewish people. Remember, he's starting off, listen, we were ready to go straight into Eretz Yisrael after the giving of the Torah. And he should have gone straight to it, and you asked for spies. But instead, he feels like he has to explain that it was too much for me, and so I asked if we can have judges, and you guys said, yeah, it's a good thing, let's do judges. And we had judges, and then you guys wanted to send out spies. That's a very difficult read in the Parsha. Just a straightforward question. The key, though, the key to this whole question is all the way back on page 940 in Pasuk Tes, where it says, V'omer elechem ba'es hahi lemor. And I said to you, the Jewish people, at that time, Lo uchal levadi se'es eschem, I'm unable to handle you. What's the ba'es hahi? What is at that time? What happened after Hashem said, okay, let's go, we've got the Torah, let's go to Eretz Yisrael? What happened that Moshe says, ba'es hahi at that time? So the Ramban, in his commentary on this pasuk, trying to answer this question, trying to explain this in a very simple pshat, that basically, this refers to the story of Yisro. That Yisro came while the Jewish people were at Chorev. As we know, there is a debate. There's a debate as to whether Yisro came before the giving of the Torah, or after the giving of the Torah. So the simple pshat is going to be that Yisro came after the giving of the Torah. So after the giving of the Torah, Yisro shows up. Yisro shows up and suggests to Moshe that we should appoint judges. Of course, Moshe leaves out for some reason, which makes the Ramban's explanation very difficult. Moshe leaves out Ha'omer davar b'shem omro. You're supposed to attribute something to the one who came up with it. He should have mentioned that it was Yisro, if that's the pshat like the Ramban. But nevertheless, the Ramban reads that this is referring to Yisro showing up and asking for judges. And he says, and even if you learn Yisro was saying, Yisro came before the giving of the Torah, nevertheless, says the Ramban, the point is that it was actually the judges who approached Moshe demanding spies. That as long as it was Moshe leading all the Jewish people, it was just Moshe at the top and the people at the bottom, so there was no one who felt empowered to tell Moshe what to do. But once we had judges, once we had people who were in charge of other people, once we had Moshe who had given power to these people to make decisions, anything that they wouldn't know what to do, they would bring to him. So that empowered them to form a committee to approach Moshe Rabbeinu demanding for spies.
So that's why he doesn't mention Yisro there. Out of respect for his father-in-law, he doesn't want to lay that at Yisro's.
That's an interesting explanation. I think that's a fair explanation. And in other words, when Yisro first suggests it, Moshe kind of is worried about it, feeling like once you hand off the power to someone else, you kind of have to trust that they're going to make the right decision. And since here he's about to show how it had an element of a bad decision in it, so he didn't want to mention that. So that's a nice shot. I think that's fair. Within the Ramban. Yeah.
Well, there's an indefinite allusion to Yitro, because Yitro's the first one who said to him, you can't do this, carry these people on your own.
Yeah, I mean, allusion is fine. I mean, he does. But the problem is, he speaks it as if it's his own words. Lo ucha, I said, you know what? This is just too much for me. That's not what happened. Yisro says to him, this is too much for you. Moshe was ready to handle it. So yeah, he would be echoing those words, which we'll see, because actually those words do appear somewhere else in the Torah. We'll get to that in just a second.
I was just going to ask you whether he might want to spare the possible interpretation of this being a criticism of Yitro.
Well, that's kind of what Kathy was saying.
But because he just recently had him telling them to hate the Midianites.
In other words, after the Midianites, and then people might still be, maybe.
It would diminish the authority of a leader, even as humble as Moshe Rabbeinu was, to say, oh, by the way, Yitro has this great idea. He had to make it himself to lend itself to authority. It's a natural.
I don't know. I would find it might be true if it was a nobody, but if it was his father-in-law or an advisor,
No, but it would diminish him completely in the eyes of Bnei Israel if he has to take advice from a guy who Bnei Israel doesn't know from bringing them out of Egypt. Here's this guy comes after Matan Torah. He's going to tell us what to do. It would be a mistake for Moshe to even mention it.
Maybe. I hear the suggestion. I'm not sure if that concurs with everything we find in the Torah in terms of what Moshe does do.
He was a
But
leader. He knew it was good.
Right? But just maybe personally, because I wouldn't be disappointed if Moshe, on the contrary, if someone would say, well, I got this advice from someone, but maybe, I mean, that's...
You know the old saying, the buck stops here? Moshe took the buck. He didn't want to bring Yisro into it. Yisro went to him and said, you can't carry this thing alone. And he said, tell the people that. Tell the people that. So when the idea went good, when it sounded good, it was good. When the idea went bad, he didn't want to bring Yisro into it because he didn't want to cause him pain.
Well, that's similar to what I was saying, that maybe once it's a bad idea, he kind of took the blame himself, which is what you suggest. I think that's a fair suggestion within the Ramban, because the Ramban is clearly learning that this is a reference to the story of Yisro, and it's just Moshe kind of changing the information. But the Ramban is saying this because the Ramban learns that this is maybe even Moshe kind of pointing to, I wanted to do this myself, and you guys, so you know what, let's just look at it from this, maybe. Because he is explaining that it's the judges who approached, and that explains the flow. We were at Chorev, God said to go, we appointed the judges, then you guys approached me for spies, so the Ramban, it was the judges who approached wanting spies. However, the Ramban is picking a side. What I mean by that is the Ramban is obviously aware that in the Medrash there's a debate as to what Ba'es Hahi at that time means. The first opinion in the Medrash is that it's referring to Yisro, as the Ramban explains. But, if I may ask you to turn all the way back to Parshas Bahaloscha, so on page 790, this is after the Jewish people complained, and they said, we don't have all the food we want, we don't have all the wonderful pleasantries that we had in Egypt. Imagine that. But you see, Moshe on page 790, Pasuk Yudalet says, Lo uchal anochi levadi laseisas kol ha'am hazeh, ki kaved mimeni. Moshe actually does say those words. Moshe says, I'm unable to bear the burden, which actually resembles the words he's using here, where it says, Lo uchal levadi se'es aschem. There it says, Lo uchal anochi levadi laseisas kol ha'am hazeh. So clearly, says the other opinion in the Medrash, no, that this is referring to the story of the Misonim. And what did God say to Moshe when Moshe said, I can't handle these people, they're too much for me? I'm going to appoint 70 elders. And the 70 elders were appointed. Of course, the 70 elders being appointed, that does lead in the next parsha to the spies. That's the next thing that happens in the Torah. The only problem is that in that story, how many elders are appointed? 70. What's Moshe referring to here?
The judges.
To the judges, the masters of the thousands, the hundreds, and the tens. Those are the judges clearly mentioned in Parshas Yisro as appointed by Yisro. So now we've got a mixture. Again, this opinion learns, and it fits much better, that Moshe is saying at the time of the misonanim, at the time of the complainers, I said to Hashem, I'm unable to bear the burden of these people, and that sits very well, and then I appointed these 70 judges, and that would lead to the spies, and fits very well. The only problem is that where does Moshe say? And so I appointed the 10,000s, the 100,000s, the 10,000s. That happened back in the story of Yisro. So the commentaries give an explanation, which is not going to help the case too much. And they say that Yisro suggested all the way back, maybe even before the giving of the Torah or soon after, that Moshe appoint judges. And Moshe accepted the advice of Yisro, asked Hashem, Hashem agreed with it, but they never actually appointed the judges.
How could that be? In Pinchas we have...
Well, he says, and then, when they got too much because the people complained by the misonanim, then Moshe says, okay, you know what? I've been holding on to these appointments of all these appointments that I people that I need to appoint. Let me appoint them now. And so he appointed the masters of the thousands and 10,000s and 50s and all those judges were appointed a long time later. It's not too long later. It's still within that first year or so. It's after within the second year, right before the spies. But Moshe did not appoint them originally at the time of Yisro, but he waited until later to appoint them. And that makes everything fit. That's why Moshe is referring to the story of the Misonanim, and then I appointed judges, not just the 70 elders, but even the previous judges who I had been putting off appointing, because Moshe liked to keep everything under control. But once he was making the 70, he had then appointed all the judges, and that's exactly what he's saying in this week's parasha. At that point, everything fell apart. Once you hand off the things to lesser people than Moshe, things get dropped. And so that's what led to the story of the spies.
Doesn't the parsha, though, where Yisro suggests he do that, doesn't it say that he didn't?
Yeah, it says it did. It doesn't say when. So we would just say that eventually that would happen. And this Medrash learns that here Moshe is identifying the point at which he did it, which was when he himself finally actually agreed. In other words, when Yisro said it, he intellectually agreed that eventually it would become too burdensome for him. So he had the people look for judges and he tested them and they ran a whole process of finding judges, but he never brought it into the system until he himself kind of said, you know what, I should do it.
That makes a lot of sense, because if Yitro put him before the situation, and he had reasons to deny the situation for as long as possible until he really came to this.
Right. I think to a certain degree, I think we can all understand it because all of us do that. Someone tells us we have to do something, we start the process, but then until the deadline actually comes, we don't.
Maybe that's why Yisro left.
Right. Yisro leaves right before this. Right. He leaves right before this, so he waits till after Yisro leaves to appoint those judges. Interesting. I'm sure we could discuss that at length.
If Hashem just gave him 70 elders who would get Ruach HaKodesh, why would he do judges in addition to the elders?
Well, once he's already giving away the power, he says, you know what, I've had enough with these people. Appoint 70 elders, and here's the list of judges, appoint them too. In other words, that was all. Once he hit that place of frustration where he could no longer tolerate people who were just complaining for the sake of complaining, like the people were sitting there amongst all their cows complaining they had no meat. So when he got to that point, Moshe says, you know what, take your elders, your judges, have whoever you want. And that would lead to the spies, because then they say, oh, well, now we're judges, we're elders, we're wise people, we're entitled to form all kinds of coalitions.
Because by that time they messed up, he saw that, well, we have no choice but to break them up, but to actually follow Yitro's advice.
Well, that's what he's saying. Yeah, at this point, we're just going to do it.
Because he probably would not be doing the same mistake of giving away the power if he already gave it to the judges, unless the judges were really working perfectly.
Well, that's what we say. Once he felt like he was giving it away, he just let the whole thing go. And it goes wrong, because that's where the spies come from.
It just wasn't the nature of the fact that they were complaining. It was what they were complaining about, the type of complaining that they were doing.
Oh, we're going to get to that point, hopefully soon.
Because if you have serious complaints, that's one thing. But these complaints were narishkeit. They were whining.
Yeah, we're going to get to that in just a little bit. So the problem still stands as to why Moshe delays it that long. I mean, we've given answers that maybe he was trying to hold on to it, but seemingly it's still difficult. So the Shem Shmuel suggests a explanation in the world of machshava and musar, which I think all of us need to take it in to try to help us prepare for these difficult days coming up. The Shem Shmuel quotes to us something we've discussed over the last few weeks. The conquering of Eretz Yisrael was not just a physical conquering. It was not just moving into the land and winning battles, but it was also a spiritual war. We are told that every nation has its minister, its angel, whose job it is to fight for that nation. That's why the Jewish people were afraid when they saw Mitzrayim nosea achareim, Egypt running after them. It should have said Mitzrayim, the Egyptians. But no, they saw Mitzrayim, meaning they saw the angel of Egypt was coming after them to try to fight them. Vayar Yisrael es Mitzrayim meis al sfas hayam, when they saw Egypt dead on the seashore. Egypt wasn't dead. Egypt is a country. They saw the angel. You know what his name is? He has many names, but one of his names is Mitzrayim. So they saw Mitzrayim dead on the seashore, and then they understood the great hand of Hashem. Vayaminu Hashem Moshe Avdo and Az Yashir Moshe. That's when they sing. This is something which the holy books talk about. Asks Shem Shmuel a very simple question. If the only way that we can defeat a nation is to overcome their angel, it's God who overthrows their angel. We have no means, so he says, what's the point of us going out with swords and bows and going through the land and cutting people down if that's not what it's about? If we can knock down the angel of that nation, then that country, the people will crumble on their own or flee. So why do we have a physical battle if it's about the spiritual battle? And if it's about the spiritual battle, how are we supposed to win it? That's the question. Says the Shem Shmuel, in the name of his father, an incredible idea. The father of the Shem Shmuel was the Avnei Nezer, the Iglei Tal, a great rabbi. And he explains that every one of the 70 nations has its own angel, and that angel is that nation's Yetzer Hara. Every country has its particular challenge. You may be familiar with the angel going around to all the nations, according to the Medrash Hashem, goes around to all the nations and says, would you like to receive the Torah? And they said, well, what does it say in it? So Hashem says to Esav, lo tirtzach, don't kill. They said, we were blessed. Al char b'cha tichya, by your sword you shall live. So we can't accept it. We can't give up our essence, who we are. So God moves on. To each country, this country, they says lo signov, to this one lo sachmo, to this one. So what is it that he's saying to each nation? Each nation gets faced with its greatest challenge. Says the Shem Shmuel, in the name of his father, that the Yetzer Hara of each nation, that is its minister. That is its angel. So when we come to a country, the Jewish people come to a country, we are faced more than anything with the Yetzer Hara of that country. And as long as the Yetzer Hara of that place has a power over us, we cannot defeat this nation, neither in the physical realm or in the spiritual realm. He says, but as soon as we overcome the Yetzer Hara of that nation, that is the kibush haaretz that we are supposed to do. That is how we win wars. We overcome the spiritual challenge of that peoples, overcoming the Yetzer Hara of that nation, overcoming the angel of that nation. The angel falls, and then we are able to win the war. So it's not in the hands of Hashem. It is Hashem has to take care of that. Everything that happens above. But what we have to do below is overcome the challenge of that nation. Now, if you think about it, you can go through history and see all the countries that the Jewish people were in and try to figure out what the particular challenges of each nation were. Certainly, if you go through the world today, you see all the different Jews who are living in different countries, the challenges of that people and with the Jews within each country is a different challenge. Whether it's a challenge not to get lost in the gashmias of wealth and money, whether it's a challenge not to fall into atheism, whether it's a challenge not to fall into immorality, all these different challenges that exist, and how dangerous would it be if the Jewish people would end up in a country which is a bit of a melting pot and therefore absorbs many different challenges. That might be a dangerous thing. I hope that's not the case.
But in this case, do you mean something like attacking Midian because of the immorality that they did? So is that what you mean by overcoming?
So we would have had to, like it says there, that they went and they saved the women and they had no desire for them and none of them were. So it was more overcoming those desires in that war with Midian that really provided the power and the force behind them winning the war.
And with the nations of Canaan, was it?
So we'll get to Canaan in just a minute. We'll try to break that down.
But still, the Almighty wants us to kill people anyway, physically kill people.
Right. But that's going to happen. That's only going to happen if we overcome the angel. If we don't overcome the angel, we can't defeat the people.
But there seems to be something about killing men, women, and children that seems to be necessary too.
Well, that's winning a war. You still have to win the war. You have to actually vacate and remove those people.
Because they would be carrying that trait.
Right. And that's what we say, that these 7 nations were irredeemable, which is interesting, that nevertheless, even though they are irredeemable, they were still given the option to leave. In Girgashi, according to some named so because they left, we're told, pick themselves up. The entire nation of Girgashi picked themselves up and went to Africa. An entire people. And they all lived. We didn't bother them. We let them pass. We had no interest. So what happened to them? Did they somehow, by abandoning, lose whatever it was? So and let's actually go there. We'll get back to Canaan in a second. But when we're going into Eretz Yisrael, you notice how the Torah keeps telling us about all the things that those nations who used to live here used to do? That's because they're about to go in and conquer the land. And if you fall for the challenges of those people, you won't be able to conquer the land. So those people who are caught in idol worship, if you have even the slightest respect or esteem for these idols, if you don't wipe them out in the most serious and despising way, where you really despise them, shaket to shakatzenu, if you don't do it like that, you might get caught up in, which is what happens. The Jewish people felt like they didn't want to capture all the nations, and they left all these Gentiles and idol worshippers and pagans in the land, and that's the book of Shoftim. The Jewish people worshipped idols, and the enemy came to defeat them. God sent the judge who saved them. The judge died. The Jewish people worshipped idols. Repeat, wash, rinse, repeat. So, the Shem Mishmul, though, adds another layer to this. There are 2 kinds of Yetzer Haras. The first Yetzer Hara is the one that tells you, see that bad thing over there? Go do it. That cheeseburger, it's you know what? You've done a lot of good things in your life. You can do some Averos. On the contrary, Elul is coming. What are you going to do Teshuvah on? So it's an Avera. Go do it.
It's like eating a lot before you start the diet.
Right. The second Yetzer Hara is the hard one. The second Yetzer Hara is the parts of us that try to justify, where we tell ourselves that things we're not supposed to do. Well, I'm not supposed to do it, but for me, I am allowed to in this situation. And, it might be pikuach nefesh. If I'm not a happy person, a lot of people are not happy, it doesn't end well. So, I've got to, all these excuses we make ourselves, all these rationalizations, that's the most dangerous Yetzer Hara. The Gemara tells us that the Yetzer Hara has 7 names. The 7 names are Ra, Arel, Tameh, Sone, Michshol, Even, and Sophoni, which translates as evil, Arel, or would you say blocked up, Tamei, impure, enemy, stumbling block, and stone makes our hearts like stone. And those represent different kinds of challenges. Arel represents where we become numb and blocked to what's bad. Michshol refers to a stumbling block or something that trips us up, but we know we're tripping. Sone, enemy, that's where he brings out the hatred within us. But the seventh one is called tzfoni. Tzfoni, which might be related to the word for phony.
It's like a snake, no?
Well, that snake is also called tzfoni because of the same reason, because it sort of slithers through the brush to get you. Tzfoni is from the word tzafun, or hidden. That's the seventh Yetzer Hara, representing the Yetzer Hara that tries to fool us into thinking that something bad is good and that something good is bad.
Is it 7?
The seventh name of the Yetzer Hara. I was saying each name represents a different aspect. So this seventh aspect called tzfoni is the phony. So he explains that our enemies, each of our enemies, each nation and its particular challenge is going to connect to one of these 7, meaning the 7 will break into 70. But so there'll probably be about, he doesn't say this, but I assume 10 nations per kind of Yetzer Hara. So he says the first 3 exiles which we were in, Babylon, Persia Media, and Greece, or at least Greece is a little more difficult, but certainly in the case of Babylon and Persia Media, our challenge, what was the reason why the first Beis HaMikdash was destroyed? Avodah Zarah, Gilu Arayos, Shfichas Damim, idolatry, adultery, and murder. These are the 3 cardinal sins, and no one was convincing themselves that they were not sinning. They were Ra, they were Arel, they were Tamei, they were Michshol, they were blocked up and not feeling it, and they were caught up in it, and they were addicted to idol worship, and they couldn't get away from it, and they were so passionate and angry and murderous, and whatever the led them to do it. But they knew they were sinning. The 4th exile is the exile of Sinas Chinam. That's the exile where we think that we are right. We are doing a mitzvah. That person deserves to be told off. That person is no good. It's such a shame that everyone can't get along. Because I get along with everyone, and it's everyone else that's not getting along with everyone else. I don't get along with everyone, but I get along with everyone who I'm supposed to get along with. And if everyone would just get along with me, all these kinds of things, it's funny, but that's how we all think. So that's the 4th exile, Galus Edom. The first 3 exiles, we talked about this many months ago, compared to the 3 animals, the camel, the hyrax, and the hare. The 4th exile is the Chazir. That's Edom, represents the Chazir. What's the difference in the non-kosher? Right.
It shows off the structure.
Right. Because the Chazir has on the outside his Chazir Fislach, making himself look like he's kosher, turning everything, and that's worse. When people say, oh, it's a shtickle Chazir. What do you mean a shtickle Chazir? A lion has no signs. The Chazir has one sign of being kosher. So why do we say, like, pig is the worst thing to eat? Shouldn't it be worse if you eat one of the animals that has no signs? The answer is no. Because it's worse when something pretends to be what it isn't. And so the Chazir puts its feet out pretending to be some righteous, holy people who just have this religion of love. And they preach all this love while they murder people in the billions over thousands of years. That's Galus Edom. That's very challenging for us. And we fell into that exile because of Sinas Chinam. Sinas Chinam, the one that doesn't look like a sin. Lashon Hara doesn't feel like murder. It doesn't feel like idolatry and adultery. Because if that were true, could you imagine if someone in the community was found out to be committing idolatry, adultery, and murder, all three, what would we do to such a person? So what did you do to the person next to you who tried to tell you a shtickle lashon hara? Because it looks like it's not so bad. So it says the Shem Shmuel, these 7 names of the Yetzer Hara, these 70 nations, the Canaanim, or I should say the 7 nations of Eretz Yisrael, were the key to the 70 nations, to the 7 levels of Yetzer Hara. And our conquering of Eretz Yisrael, meaning our redemption, our ability to earn access to the Holy Land in a full way, where we're free from our enemies, requires us overcoming all 7 challenges, requires us overcoming all 7 levels of the Yetzer Hara, including the most difficult one, that's Canaani. Canaan, the actual translation of the word, is from the language of hachna, or submission, or subdued, or incognito. Canaan is the Yetzer Hara that makes everything look like it's okay. Canaan is also the word for merchant. That's Canaan is another word for merchant, because that's what a merchant does. He has to cover over the words, and well, hopefully he's somewhat honest. But he says that's why it's called Eretz Canaan. It's called Eretz Canaan because there were 7 nations there. Canaan, Yachite, Amori. Why are we blaming it all on Canaan? Because Canaan is the most serious of our challenges. The other ones we can overcome. How long were we in exile after we were punished the first time? 70 years. It's been almost 2,000 years and we're still in exile. Because we've all convinced ourselves that we're okay and there's nothing more we need to do.
The symbolism of Girgash leaving them.
Well, you have to try to line up the 7 and the 7 and see which one it fits in. Says the Shem Shmuel that there are certain mitzvahs that help us overcome certain challenges. This is a general concept. That if there are certain people, and sometimes we don't get it, like there's a person who comes to a tzaddik and says to the tzaddik, I'm struggling with the following issue. So the tzaddik will say to him, perform that mitzvah better. And the person might not understand the connection between this mitzvah and that particular struggle, but the tzaddik does because they know these connections. Says the Shem Shmuel, so I don't know where he knows this, but this is what he says, and logically it makes sense. The mitzvah which helps us overcome the challenge of a Yetzer Hara convincing us of what's bad is good and what's good is bad is the mitzvah of appointing judges. When we as a people appoint the right people to be our leaders and judges, those people's ability to judge properly, those people's ability to look at a situation properly has an effect back on us and allows us to become better judges of ourselves. I'll say that again. By us appointing people and giving ourselves over and submitting ourselves to people who have good judgment, that expands their good judgment, and the fact that we've appointed them over us expands into us and allows us access to better judgment. So he says, before they knew that this was going to be the big challenge, it's called the land of Canaan. They were going to need this to overcome the challenges in the land of Canaan. So they knew they needed to appoint the right leaders and the judges. But he says, Shem Shmuel says, that Moshe, when Yisro came to him and said, you have to appoint judges, you can't do this all yourself. Moshe said to himself, these people don't need judges. Individually, they all have such good judgment. I've seen them individually, I've interacted with them. The people come before me every day, and I talk to them. They seem to have such clarity of judgment. Specifically, it says, selflessness. It doesn't look like these people are the kinds of people who convince themselves that what's bad is good and what's good is bad. The kind of people who come into court and Moshe is dealing with this case and he says to them, so, did you tell him you were going to make this payment on this and this day? And the person says, well, yeah, I did. Like, did you just admit that you're guilty? Yeah, I'm being honest. When you see those kinds of people coming into court, he says, at that point, Moshe Rabbeinu felt like there's no need for this particular mitzvah. These people are well-meaning and they're l'shem shamayim. And so whatever they do, they sinned with the golden calf, Moshe defends them. They're complaining they have no water, Moshe provides them. He doesn't have any issues with these people. Until Vayihi ha'am k'misonin. All of a sudden, these same people who he had so much respect for show up and say, cucumbers, melons, we remember the meat, we remember the fish that we had in Egypt. We want meat. And Moshe doesn't even recognize these people. What's happened to them? Are they thinking that what they're doing is the right thing? He says the first time Moshe saw this corruption of the judgment within the minds of the people, Moshe said, okay, it's time to appoint the judges.
What about the Egel Hazav?
He says the Egel Hazav was people who were not being selfish. It wasn't for themselves. They thought they had this understanding that they were supposed to appoint someone in place of Moshe. It was a mistake, but it wasn't driven from some internal personal agenda. As it was they were actually making sense in the case of the Egel. They did.
Is that why they partied? By Yitzchok?
Well, once they were going to do it, everything has to have a party. But it didn't start as you were pointing out before with this kind of corrupt silliness that he was seeing in the case of the Misonanim. And he says at that point, Moshe says their judgment is off.
So the very fact that the judgment went bad. Maybe it has something to do with the fact that Himamish didn't appoint those judges.
So were the judges not?
Well, that's the problem. That's the problem. The problem is that it wasn't just the people. The judges were corrupt. And then they had this incorrect judgment of demanding spies. And let's not even go with the judgments that these people made. So it was all about, they fell for the trick of the Yetzer Hara, these people came back angry. We're going to take us to the land of Canaan where we're all going to die. They fell for the exact Yetzer Hara that they was not supposed to fall for. And it just all happened suddenly. And that's what Moshe is saying here. He's saying, listen, I said to Hashem, these people, they're going crazy on me. What should I do? I appointed the judges, and from there it was all downhill.
But what would make them go wrong? What would be the...
They failed. In other words, this challenge of the Yetzer Hara started to creep into them, and they could have won, and they didn't. Much like we, 2,000 years later, are still convinced that we're doing everything right. They felt like their judgment, their vision, spiritually speaking, started to go, and it was because as they're approaching Eretz Yisrael, the challenge of Canaan comes back at them, and they lost. They lost that challenge.
It seems that these were all mistakes based on fear or feeling powerless or and selfishness.
The complaining
it seems like a slave mentality.
Well, yeah, absolutely. The concept of, but remember that's true of most sins, and that's why he's blaming it all on the Misonanim. Once they start with cucumbers and melons and fish, and they want meat when they have meat. And Rashi says, that Rashi explains there that they were actually trying to think of something they could complain about. So there, he said, that's where it all starts to go. And that just leads to one mistaken thinking after another until the Jewish people fall.
It's like if they're thinking of what to complain about, it means that they had a subconscious issue that they were actually just trying to, people look for excuses.
No. Without going into all the details of those particular sins, that's the basic idea of what was happening to them, was that they were falling for this inclination, which was trying to convince them that what was good is bad and what's bad is good.
So is that part of the reason, or one additional reason for that bracha in Shemona Esrei about judges.
Well, absolutely. I think that's a good suggestion. Hashiva Sheftenu Kuvarishona, which is bring back the judges, and that would have an effect on us and make us better judges as well. Right. And then, V'lam al Shinim, V'alat Tzadikim, right, only then can we get rid of the wickedness in the world. That's I think, a beautiful thought to have, especially for these days. Now, the Shem Shmuel was actually giving this Torah on Shabbos. So these are his Shalashudas Torahs in the Sefer Shem Shmuel. So everything has to tie into Shabbos. But I think it's off the topic, but I want to say it anyway. He says that that's part of the thing. That's why Shabbos is Me'ein Olam Haba. Shabbos is a semblance of the world to come. Because on Shabbos, everyone is elevated in terms of their clarity. He quotes the Mizmor Shir Liyom HaShabbos, and there it says, "Vatabeit eini b'shurai," that my eyes are seeing straight, and that's why the song of Shabbos is all about how, even though it looks like the good is failing and evil is winning, but it's all tzaddik hatama yifrach. Everything will end up being good because Shabbos gives us a higher level of clarity. Says that's why the Gemara in Tanis tells us that the Beis Hamikdash was destroyed on Motzei Shabbos. The enemies entered after Shabbos ended, which at this time of the year would be pretty late, but they made it then at that time of the night. Why Motzei Shabbos? So he says because as long as it was Shabbos, the Jewish people were elevated to an extent that kept away Edom. That kept away that fourth exile, it kept them away because they were a little more clear in terms of their judgments of their self. But when Shabbos goes away, much like when you don't appoint the right judges, it has this, the Jewish people fell a little bit, and that gave the boost to the Edomites, which allowed them to enter the sanctuary and destroy the Beis Hamikdash.
Is there some connection with if you think of Ashes Kyle as the Shabbos queen, how she can trade with the merchants, or is that a different word for merchants? I've always wondered.
No, that's the word Kanani, right.
Because she has the power to overcome the Kanani and...
Oh, I'm fired today. Okay, very good, yeah.
No, I wondered about that for quite a long time. Why is that in Ashes Chayil, and how does that have to do with... And now this makes sense.
Right. Yeah, it does. What's the pasuk? It's...
You quoted, I can't.
Sadin asasav atimkar v'chagar nasna laknani. Right, so there, the Kanani there means merchant, not Canaanite. So what you're suggesting, and I should repeat it for the recording, that what you're suggesting is that the Eshes Chayil's ability is to affect the whole household, that Chagor Nasna Laknani, to maybe put a binding or to interact and control that element of Kanani and sort of give everyone a better understanding of what's right and what's wrong. Maybe. See if the men agree. I don't have much time. I just want to put in, just one additional point to this. The Gemara in Gittin tells us that after the story of Kamsa and Bar Kamsa, clearly everyone misjudged what they should be doing. This person invited the wrong person. That person ended up coming with the wrong impression, thinking that he was going to be forgiven. He shows up. This man has the wrong idea about how to treat the situation. He gets thrown out. The rabbis are there, and they don't do anything about it. He decides he's going to start trouble, and so he goes to the king and says, the Jews have rebelled against you. He says, prove it. He says, send an offering. Everyone knows this story very well. And he goes and puts a blemish in the offering, one that the Romans would not consider a blemish, but the Jews would. And they took it up to the Beis HaMikdash. The rabbis are in the Beis HaMikdash. The Sanhedrin is right there, or at least within the vicinity. At that time, it would have been somewhere in the vicinity. And the question is being faced, do we bring up this offering? So the rabbis said, no, we have to bring it. we have to keep peace with the Romans, and it's a question of pikuach nefesh, and certainly it's not one of the cardinal sins to bring a offering with a blemish in it. So let's bring it. Amaluhu Reb Zechariah ben Avkulas, said Reb Zechariah ben Avkulas, Yomru, they'll say, Balimumin Kraven Legabe Mizbeach, they'll say that we can bring blemished animals on the altar. It's going to start a press that we just can't have, so we can't do it. So they had another plan, which was to execute Bar Kamsa. And he said, no, we can't do that. Because that's going to set a precedent where people will think that putting a blemish into a sacrifice comes with the death penalty, which it doesn't. Says the Gemara.
Couldn't they do a discrete switch?
No, apparently not.
What if that, that way the Romans would think it was, no one would know the difference?
I imagine that there was some Roman who had his job as part of the Secret Service to protect the Roman tribute to the Jewish temple. So that would be my best guess. So says the Gemara, Amar Rabbi Yochanan, the humility of Rabbi Zechariah ben Avkulas destroyed our house and burnt our temple and has exiled us from our land. Rabbi Yochanan says it all comes down to Rabbi Zechariah ben Avkulas and his improper understanding. You should know that throughout the story of Tisha B'Av, many times, the Gemara, a number of times, it uses the phrase, Meishiv chachamim achor v'datam yisachel. That the rabbis were just missing everything. They were missing the point. In what?
Where does it say?
In the Gemara. The Gemara quotes the verse, Meishiv chachamim achor, that when God wants something to happen, He makes smart people make bad decisions. So the Gemara says, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai made bad decisions. They're all making bad decisions in the Gemara. All the rabbis. They're these brilliant men, and strategically, they're basically doing things that will allow the destruction of the temple. So the Gemara argues, and the Gemara says that they really did have a logic to them. They felt that if we would do it differently, that things would not work out very well. Whatever the case is, but it seems that it all comes down to incorrect judgment on the parts of these people. And according to the Shem Shmuel, that's exactly what it was. Just like when we have good judges, when we have good leaders, and when we appoint the right leaders, they have an effect on us, and they bring us to a better judgment, just throughout, the way that they express themselves, the way that they teach us, the way that they speak to us. It educates us to think properly and to make the right decisions. When we have foolish leaders, it does the opposite. But the same is true of the people as well. When we as a people are bad judges and we convince ourselves and we fall under the traps of the Kanani, of the inclination which is concealed, it has an effect on our leaders as well. So I'm wondering, and I don't know what the answer to this would be, so is it the people who were being foolish who messed up their leaders who then asked for spies, or was it an appointment of bad leaders which led them to become foolish afterwards? I don't know. I don't know which one it is. But what I do know is that we don't have the ability to go back and to try to correct or fix anyone else. If the challenge of Edom is the challenge of sins that are made to look like they're not so bad. We live in a world today where people don't say it's okay to do certain things. They say if you call these things bad, you're a sinner. The way that this world is set up is that good is turned into bad and bad is turned into good. And the challenge for us is to be able to see through and be proper judges. Not judges of someone else, though. Judges of ourselves. If someone appoints you judge over them, like you appoint the judges, then you can be a judge over them. But if that person hasn't appointed you, we've all got enough to work on ourselves. We have a few days coming until Tisha B'Av. Moshe says, Echa esa levadi. How can I do this alone? These people, if they're not going to, on their own, work on themselves to try to improve themselves, there's nothing that can be done. We have to work on sinas chinam to increase our avas chinam, to have greater love for each other, and to see things the way they should be seen. May we be zocha that we should all receive this judgment. Our sages and our judges should be returned. We should all be fixed in every way that we can, and we should be zocha to the binyan beis hamikdash b'mhera v'yamin.
Thank you.